Hi, everyone, and welcome to yet another session of the African Epistemology's Advanced Seminar Series. My name is Olerato Mokhomotsi, and I'm a philosopher and doctoral fellow at the Institute of Humanities in Africa. So on behalf of Dr. Divine Fa and the convener of the seminar series, Dr. Sanya Osha, we welcome you, and we would like to thank you for joining Humor today. Before continuing, please make sure that you rename yourself, including your name and surname, to avoid getting kicked out of the session. And please note that the seminar has been recorded and live streamed, so attendance is tacit consent. At Humor, we also organize several seminar series which may be of interest to you, including the Publishing Africa Seminar Series, the Attire Seminar Series, the Ethical Humanitarianism Series, doctoral seminars, and the book launch seminars. And you can find all the information on this on the Humor website. For today's African Epistemology's Advanced Seminar Series, we are joined by Keolebogile Mbebe, who lectures in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria. She is currently completing her PhD in jurisprudence at the University of Pretoria. She has multiple research interests, including, but perhaps not limited to, the issues of justice, race, emotions, moral philosophy, and the philosophy of law. Ms. Mbebe is a founding member of the Azanian Philosophy Society, a multidisciplinary and humanities association. She has recently published a journal article titled "Whites Cannot Be Black, a Biko's Challenge to Professor Kolela Mangu," and has an upcoming book chapter on Blackness as a Challenge to Phenomenology. So for tonight's talk, Ms. Mbebe will present the topic titled "The Miscarriage of Ubuntu in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa." Ms. Mbebe will present for around 30 to 40 minutes, and then afterwards we will have ample time for discussion. Keolebogile, thank you for coming. You may take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Olerato. I'll begin my paper now. The paper being proposed argues that the TRC did not take seriously the ethic of the indigenous people conquered in the unjust wars of colonization in South Africa, ubuntu, and instead perpetuated the cycle of epistemic violence through the logic in its diagnosis and prognosis of historical injustice in South Africa. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, the TRC, is still considered a model to be followed worldwide in societies undergoing regime change after periods of gross injustice. And there is still a widely held belief that the TRC was a necessary step in helping the country avoid civil unrest resulting from the end of formal legal apartheid. It's been called a miracle and an example of how to negotiate the transition from an unjust political order to a just one. The legislative genesis of the TRC is in the Interim Constitution of South Africa of 1993, which called for a mechanism through which amnesty shall be dealt with for the sake of reconciliation between the people of South Africa and the reconstruction of society. This reconciliation and reconstruction were the goals to which the nation should aspire, and which would only take place if there was understanding of people's experiences of the past and not vengeance for their deeds, reparation of relationship and not retaliation, and Ubuntu as opposed to victimization. Ubuntu in particular is the concern of this paper. The Constitution, the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, which was the legislation behind the TRC, which I will call the PNR, and the Interim Constitution, as well as the explanatory memorandum to the PNR, did not give direct definitions of Ubuntu. I will build up a notion of Ubuntu assumed in this set of legislations with additional commentary from others who articulated the TRC's version. What we can note from the post-amble of the interim constitution is that Ubuntu is harmonious with understanding and reparation and antithetical to vengeance and retaliation, and especially victimization. The explanatory memorandum, while not mentioning Ubuntu save as a quotation from the interim constitution, nevertheless gives us an indication of the epistemic field within which Ubuntu was to function. According to the explanatory memorandum, the purpose of the PNR was to bring about unity and reconciliation by providing for the investigation and full disclosure of gross violations of human rights committed in the past. It is based on was based on the principle that reconciliation depends on forgiveness, and that forgiveness can only take place if gross violations of human rights are fully disclosed. What is therefore envisaged is reconciliation through a process of national healing. This is a quote from the explanatory memorandum. What was envisaged through the employment of Ubuntu, therefore, was unity and reconciliation. How so? What was Ubuntu and what role was it supposed to play? According to Constitutional Court Judge O'Regan, speaking in 1995, the new legal order in South Africa would reject the apartheid legal order and affirm the equal worth of all South Africans. Thus, recognition and protection of human dignity, she said, is the touchstone of the new political order and is fundamental to the new constitution. An ethic of Ubuntu would play a role in, quote, strengthening of the restorative dimensions of justice, end quote. This is in the report of the TRC. This restorative dimension of justice came to be incorporated into the TRC's conception of restorative justice, which was defined in the report as quote, a process which firstly seeks to redefine crime by shifting the primary focus of crime from the breaking of laws or offenses against a faceless state to a perception of crime as violations against human beings and as injury or wrong done to another person. Secondly, a process which is based on reparation. It aims at the healing and the restoration of all concerned, of victims in the first place, but also of offenders, their family, and the larger community. Thirdly, restorative justice is a process which encourages victims, offenders, and the community to be directly involved in resolving conflict with the state and legal professionals acting as facilitators. And lastly, it's a process which supports a criminal justice system that aims at offender accountability, full participation of both the victims and offenders, and making good or putting right what was wrong, end quote. According to Desmond Tutu, the chairperson of the commission, having a retributive response to perpetrators would not have been a viable option, bearing in mind the need for national unity. This is the conclusion reached when retributive justice is assumed to have little regard for the well-being of both victims and perpetrators. Instead, says Tutu, the idea of justice embodied by the commission was restorative justice, which he explains to be a tenet of Ubuntu. Ubuntu, a Zulu word with numerous variations from the Bantu language lexicon, translatable as humanness, is generally considered to be based on the maxim, Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. A person is a person through her relationships with other persons. According to Tutu, a person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good. For he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed or treated as if they are less than they are. Social harmony is the greatest good. Anything that subverts, that undermines the sought after good is to be avoided like the plague. Anger, resentment, lust for revenge, even success through aggressive competitiveness are corrosive of this good. To forgive, according to Tutu, is not just to be altruistic, it is the best form of self-interest. Further, according to Tutu, restorative justice led by Ubuntu called for reconciliation over retributive justice. Many truth commissions have not included reconciliation as a goal, and so it does not feature as a defining element of truth commissions, but in the case of South Africa, it was. According to the explanatory memorandum, the PNR or the TRC in the long run was based on the principle that reconciliation depends on forgiveness and that forgiveness can only take place if gross human rights violations are fully disclosed. What is therefore envisaged is reconciliation through a process of national healing. The kind of reconciliation envisaged by the decision makers behind the TRC process sometimes regarded reconciliation as both a goal and a process that had to take place at multiple levels. These included reconciliation of victims with their own pain, perpetrators with their guilt and shame, between victims and perpetrators, between the oppressed Black population and the former state, between the young and the old, men and women, neighbors, as well as between different ethnic and racial groups. This was a far more personal approach, which sees the offense as something that has happened to people and whose consequences are rupture in relationships. Given this quotation about the kind of virtues that embody someone with ubuntu, just to go back to what Tutu said, he said that anger, resentment, lust for revenge, even success through aggressive competitiveness are corrosive of the good of social harmony. And so forgiveness is to be altruistic. Given this quotation about the kind of virtues that embody something with Ubuntu, I will turn to discussing the virtues of forgiveness and reconciliation through which Ubuntu was thought to operate in the TRC episteme. There are two arguments made by proponents of Truth and Reconciliations Commissions: the argument for catharsis and the argument from the restoration of relationship. With the argument from catharsis, the problem is seen as the trauma experienced by victims. This trauma may manifest as anger or psychological pain or resentment, etc. The aim of forgiveness is to allow the victims to heal from these emotions. Restorative justice can honor the need for the victim's healing, a catharsis, if they are receptive to the possibility of repairing the relationship the offender has damaged. Alex Borain, one of the architects of the act, argues that, or the process rather, argues that the logic of truth commissions is that the victim's testimonies were not for historical accuracy because they could not always be verified, but had the psychological function of a catharsis, the purpose of which was to foster healing. Truth-telling by the victims embodied recognition of victims' dignity by acknowledging their unjust experience of pain. But the healing that was envisaged was not just for the victims, but for the country as a whole. This exercise, it was envisioned, exercise in forgiveness, would help to get victims on the road to forgiveness, the end of which was reconciliation, the exercise of truth-telling. The first argument for forgiveness from catharsis is closely related to the second, that from restoration of relationship. According to the explanatory memorandum, the act was, quote, based on the principle that reconciliation depends on forgiveness. And reconciliation through a process of national healing, healing brought about by forgiveness on the part of victims. When victims receive perpetrators with forgiveness, it says in the explanatory memorandum, forgiveness will follow confession and healing will happen, and so contribute to national unity and reconciliation. This forgiveness may also free the perpetrator from their self-imposed prison of guilt. In his book, No Future Without Forgiveness, Tutu describes forgiveness as relinquishing one's right to enact retribution on a perpetrator, and it is a relinquishment that liberates the victim from the negative psychological burden of seeking retribution. For philosopher John Hampton, forgiveness means that the victim no longer relates to the offender just in terms of their crime, but that the relationship is renewed so that there's a possibility of relating on other, quote, friendlier terms. This is the notion of forgiveness that the TRC supported and presented as an outworking of an Ubuntu-based ethical approach espoused by Ubuntu, where the central concern, quote, the central concern is not retribution or punishment, but the spirit of Ubuntu, the healing of breaches, the redress of imbalances, the restoration of broken relationships. This kind of justice seeks to rehabilitate both the victim and the perpetrator, who should be given the opportunity to be reintegrated into the community he or she has injured by his or her offense. Right, now this is the critique of the TRC's notion of Ubuntu. Ironically, while this emphasis on developing Ubuntu is included in the aims of the process of reconciliation, it is mentioned, Ubuntu is mentioned only 3 times in the report, or an explanation of it. This lackluster conception of Ubuntu in the legislation, process, and report of the TRC has given rise to the critique that Ubuntu was used as a buzzword for any kind of conciliatory sentiment by African people. This is given the fact that Ubuntu appears only once in the interim constitution as a governing ethic. Ubuntu opposed to victimization, and the same is also done in the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, whereas it was reiterated numerously in the process of the TRC, but again, in the report, it was given a very short cursory explanation as to what it is. This lackluster conception of Ubuntu in the legislation, process, and report of the TRC has given rise to the critique that Ubuntu was used as a buzzword for any kind of conciliatory sentiment by African people. Philosopher Mokgobe Ramose argues that this inclusion of Ubuntu in the epistemological paradigm of the TRC could have been demonstrated by the visible and sustained implementation of traditional African cultural principles and methods of reconciliation. For Ramose, the major flaw with the conception of Ubuntu in the PNR and subsequent legislation of the TRC is that it treated Ubuntu as an ethic devoid of actual restoration. Ramose argues that if the rupture of relationship is to be taken seriously, then the initial injustice that brought about that injustice must be confronted and rectified. For Ramose, the central injustice from which every other originates is the dispossession of land and violation of territorial sovereignty of who he calls the indigenous people conquered in the unjust wars of colonization. Not only are the unjust wars of colonization to be central to the discussion on the pursuit of a just relationship between the conquered and conquerors, so too should other instances of conquest such as slavery in the Western Cape, numerous wars of resistance in the interior, and genocide against some indigenous populations. A key issue in the TRC conceptualization of Ubuntu lies in the translation of the word Ubuntu itself. For Ramose, a faithful explanation of the maxim, Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, is that a human being is a human being in the ethical sense only through the recognition, respect, affirmation, and promotion of the well-being of other human beings, including the whole of nature. In his explanation, Ubuntu is better translated as humanness as opposed to humanity, whereas humanness, distinguished by the suffix ness, is grounded on a conception of the human being as a being whose humanness is both immutable and contingent. It is quite possible to say in a Bantu language that mutu ole hasi mutu, translatable as that human being is not a human being. The metaphysical identification of a human being is not the same as the ethical quality of acting as a human being. A human being's humanness is inextricably bound with that of others. Their humanness is contingent on whether they treat other people and the rest of nature with recognition, respect, affirmation, and promotion of their well-being, according to Ramuse. However, human relationships are also contingent on the prioritization of ubuntu in that relationship. Relationships are not important for their own sake, but for the sake of ubuntu and abantu. An offense in this sense is an action that does not promote this well-being of relationship. An offense is not forgotten or ignored or set aside for the sake of a relationship either. Rather, the disruption of the requirement for redress pervades the relationship of abantu. With ubuntu, molato ga o bole, an offense does not rot. I will now give an ubuntu-based conception of moral offense as espoused by Ramuse's philosophy. Molato ga o bole, go bola nama, can be sufficiently translated as an offense does not rot, it is meat that rots. To explain this legal principle, I start with a characterization of the ubuntu conception of the nature of an offense. Please hold, I've lost my place. Okay. Molato ga o bole places the offense in the metaphysical realm outside linear time. Whereas the TRC episteme considers that molato wa bola, there are certain wrongs, meaning there are certain wrongs which are so far back in time, they can be taken to not be able to be rectified so far back that that the offense becomes extinct from the present due to the passage of time. Molato ga o bole places the offense in the metaphysical realm outside linear time, as opposed to the tendency of meat to rot when it is left unattended for too long. There's a point where the meat loses its integrity through the passage of time, as demonstrated in the decomposition process. It is not the same with an offense. An offense is in the realm of irrevocable time, a time that cannot expire. Therefore, to use the word rot with regard to the effect of the passage of time on an offense is a categorical mistake. A historical narrative about historical injustice, informed by molato ga o bole, calls for the recollection of that which has been obfuscated, erased, and qualified, the sovereignty of the indigenous people over their land, and the epistemological and ethical ramifications of reconciliation of this recollection. Ramuse's argument is not reserved for the limits of the TRC's inquiry into apartheid abuses. Limits being that it focused on too short a time period, that it didn't encompass all other kinds of abuses, that it didn't focus on socioeconomic justice, etc. So his argument is not reserved to the limits of those critiques. He is calling for a problematizing and a remedying of the focus on apartheid as the core antagonism between the indigenous peoples conquered in the unjust wars of colonization and their conquerors. The injustice of conquest and colonization cannot be dismissed because the recollection of what has been, of acts of commission or omission, or a responsibility abdicated, shall not be erased until substantive justice in the form of recovery and restoration of lost sovereignty remedies the situation. For Ramuse, virtues such as forgiveness can then take place when the conqueror disavows the conquest through reparation. and restoration of sovereignty. That is when the offender starts acting as ubuntu. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Keolebogile. Definitely did enjoy your presentation as someone who has also been interested in how we deal with the TRC, and particularly how we deal with rainbow nationism in the contemporary times. And I think it's quite important to really entertain these preliminary conversations around just the conceptualization of the promise of rainbow nationism in the first place, because I think it'll help us gain a lot of answers around what is going on with us today, with all this disillusionment that we are starting to see with the promise of, I guess, institutions and processes like the TRC. Before I go any further, are there any questions in the room for Keolebogile? Any burning questions? You can raise your hand if you have a question or put it in the chat. We have a question from Vanessa. Please, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, Vanessa.
Thank you, Ole, and thank you so much to Keolebogile as well. I'm just wondering if you could perhaps expand a little bit more and maybe share some of your perspective on the question around whether or not what was envisioned for the TRC to do was far and beyond what it was able or capable of doing. And in much the same way, what we hope concepts and perhaps say practices of Ubuntu, what we hope they do and what we wish they did, they don't quite, I mean, it's an impossible, say, a mammoth of a task, and we are asking, those kinds of concepts to work in ways that they cannot, right? And so in the absence or in that gap, what are the alternatives? Or maybe not the alternatives, but are there possible gap fillers? And do you have some framings or concepts that you think would be better suited or would be good to fill those gaps? And what does that then also, perhaps in your articulation of that, what does that then mean for how we imagine a new South Africa, right? And yeah, so perhaps it's I guess a multi-layered question, and I'm very happy to hear your answer whichever way you feel comfortable to. But I was just curious about that, and thank you so much for your presentation.
You can go ahead, Keolebogile. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks, Vanessa. Okay. What was the TRC meant to do? Okay, first and foremost, the TRC started off as an amnesty commission, because in the interim constitution, the idea was that without amnesty, there couldn't be reparation in society, there couldn't be well-being, there couldn't be national unity. And so the problem was, what do we do with political crimes? What do we do with perpetrators of gross human rights violations during apartheid? And the answer was an amnesty commission. As time passed, the interim constitution became law in 1993. As time passed and there were numerous conferences being held about what to do to help the country transcend its past, then the idea of a reconciliation, a truth and reconciliation commission came about. So if it comes to amnesty, when it comes to TRCs and amnesty commission, I can see how that would have worked out if it had stuck to, we are here to find out forensic evidence for what happened during apartheid, gross human rights violations that took place. We are here to hear from the perpetrators themselves as to how they were involved. And we will then give amnesty, conditional amnesty. I think if it had stuck to that, would have made sense. But what it ended up being was part of a national narrative that framed the country as going, as inaugurating the kind of society where we have a common or collective history and a collective memory, which would then lead to a collective identity as South Africans, hence the idea of national unity. We will become a nation. So the TRC wasn't supposed to do that by itself, but it was supposed to promote that. So if we look at narrative building documents, such as the interim constitution, in the post-amble of the interim constitution, we've got that phrase, this constitution represents a bridge from a past characterized by conflict to a future characterized by the respect of human rights. We've got that. We've got the TRC saying we're going to do this through truth-telling, through hearings, through investigations. Then you've got the 1995 Constitution, which adds to the national narrative by then saying, okay, now we have become this country, and this is the Constitution that's going to govern our social fabric. Okay, so what the TRC did was a mammoth task that you have to ask whether one process like the TRC could become something that would actually have material change. So in the critiques that are there about the TRC, there's numerous critiques. One of them was that the way it framed historical injustice was very, very limited. First of all, it looked at gross human rights violations. So the only injustices it looked at was gross human rights violations. And this was killings, abductions, torture, and severe acts of ill treatment. Secondly, it looked only at those gross human rights violations from 1960 onwards, and particularly from the Sharpeville massacre of 1960 onwards. So it also did not deal with apartheid atrocities from when apartheid itself started. Okay. Another problem identified was that because it focused on this person-to-person or victim and perpetrator relationship, it didn't shed light on the victim-beneficiary relationship, where a lot of white people did not pull triggers, but they benefited from a system where people were victimized. Okay, so then the question becomes, if it had done those things, if it had started from even 1948 or maybe even 1652, if it had defined injustice to include dispossession of land, and if it had just broadened its mandate, would we then be sitting in a place where we are grateful for the mechanism of the TRC? I think for me that is still up in the air. Like you're saying, is that kind of mechanism even possible? And then you asked if there were alternatives. I think politically there's always alternatives. There could have been a revolution, there could have been a coup. There could have been forgetting, blanket amnesty. Some nations like Spain and Mozambique have taken the road of let's just not address what happened and let's just become anew. So I think the challenge on us today is to really value imagination. I think a lot of the times when people talk about the TRC, they just think, well, we were going to have a civil war if it hadn't happened, It doesn't have to be either to TRC or a civil war. There's got to be a space for political and ethical imagination. And I think that's the challenge for us today. In terms of Ramos's critique, it really is about this episteme of a restoration of relationship that is not based on the initial harm, but based on what's politically expedient to get us from 1993 to 1995. So I hope that response shed light on the questions.
Thank you so much, Keo. Sane, you can go next.
Thank you, Ole. Hello, Keo, the talk. I'm just like wondering, when I look at the whole idea of healing and forgiveness, for me, that's very like personal, right? It's very like internal. However, when you're looking at this whole thing with the TRC and also the adoption of Ubuntu, okay, Ubuntu, it's a attractive communal ethic, but however, it's very like external, right? So it seems like we're trying to use this external approach to fix something that is very like internal, but also I'm just like wondering, if it is Ubuntu, why did they not like use maybe retributive justice instead of like restorative justice? I think it's just like a comment more than a question. Thank you.
Thanks, Sane. Go ahead.
Let me see if I can remember the question. What is the first part of the question? Oh, forgiveness and something being personal. Yes, one of the critiques of the TRC was that it prescribed forgiveness onto the victims. It placed this moral burden of victims to forgive in order to put this process on a conveyor belt, as said in the explanatory memorandum, reconciliation depends on forgiveness. And so if victims did not forgive, then you also have this weird conclusion where people can be victims and be doing the wrong thing, can be victims and doing a moral wrong by not forgiving, which obviously is very suspect and dubious. And another thing about forgiveness as well is that if it has an affective and psychological component, it's not something that then can be prescribed. If the state says, forgive, or even as Desmond Tutu did at a meeting of clergy, I think it's recorded as the Rustenburg Minute or something, in one of the what's the NG Kerk domineers stood up and apologized, and on behalf of my church, etc., and Desmond Tutu, and on behalf of my people, we forgive you, I forgive you. It's not something you can do on someone's behalf, and it's not something that you can prescribe, like you can tell someone to do, that you can command. It's not something that can be done on demand, let me put it like that. And so when the state makes it seem as if the process of forgiveness has been undergone, actually it's more of an amnesty, of a pardon. It's not forgiveness, because forgiveness is so personal. There's a second part to your question. Retribution. Retribution with Ubuntu is very possible. I think the reason why Ubuntu was so handy for restorative justice, the reason why Ubuntu was so handy was that it could give flesh to this idea of restorative justice, where you don't then have to fall into the trap that critics of the TRC or truth commissions give, where they say that truth commissions sacrifice justice for the sake of peace. If you say it's restorative justice, then you can say there are other ways to get to this justice. There's another kind of justice without having to punish people. But I think we can know really in African community and the way we practice ethics, that retribution is part of it. I think even historically speaking, there's been, besides punishments and fines for wrongdoing, there even has been instances of capital punishment. So I think that's why there's this idea of Ubuntu having been used as this soft ethic that presents a solution for a political problem where retribution is inconvenient.
Thank you so much, Keo. A question from Liwaningo Baloi.
Hi, I hope you can hear me, but I wanted to ask a question about the role of guilt, because it seems as though, you know, the TRC was something that was sort of created to like assuage the guilt of people who were beneficiaries of colonialism and apartheid. And especially now in the current times, given the fact that, you know, the idea of white guilt is like such a, I don't know if it's like a buzzword or like a phrase that's very popular, but it's one of those things where like it stops and starts at the guilt, but it doesn't go any further than that. So I'm curious about what role you think that guilt could have played in a more effective commission.
Oh, okay. What role do I think? You mean white guilt?
I mean, like guilt is in, yeah, that idea of, you know, people, you know, taking accountability for the actions of others and how they may have benefited them and for their own actions as well.
Sorry, can you reframe the question? I think the word guilt is tripping me out.
Like, you know, just how can it go beyond just being a feeling? You know, how do you turn that into actions? Is it possible to turn that into actions when people feel guilty? Because there weren't, you know, so many consequences. But, you know, now that these conversations are happening more frequently, it is something that does come up where people talk about the fact that, you know, they feel bad about being beneficiaries of these systems, but then it just stops at that. They just say that they feel bad. So like, what are we supposed to do with these bad feelings that they have?
I think that really just shows the uselessness of guilt as an emotion for change. Because what it tends to do when people feel guilty, what they tend to do is find a way to take away the feeling, but not the blame. So especially if they really are benefiting from whatever moral harm has happened. So white guilt is not a helpful feeling because normally the actions that are taken to us, how do you pronounce this word? Assuage it or relieve the feeling of guilt, do not actually happen for the sake of those who've been harmed. So I'd say we just don't need white guilt or the feeling of guilt to do what needs to be done. Especially what if it doesn't take, what if what it would take for true justice to happen is more than necessary for the guilt to be assuaged? You see what I'm saying? So for instance, this is exactly what happens. People would say, yes, white privilege is a thing today, but I help my domestic worker with getting a license or taking her kids through school and so forth. Individual acts of benevolence do not lead to actual structural change and institutional reform. So my response really to the question about guilt is that it's not useful in the public sphere as much as just getting the dirty work done of figuring out a different way to administer justice in the situation that we're in than just letting things go, you know. And I think the TRC also made it easier for white people because there was that ritual. Yes, a lot has been said about the theological influences on the TRC, given that the chairman and the deputy chairman were both clergy, and there was this air of confession, of guilt and confession, and the performance of forgiveness. It was almost a ritual that was baptizing a new nation into being. And so that is easy for white people today to say, well, that was the past. We had the TRC. And so now we have to focus on the future. That assuages the guilt, and it relieves the guilt. And that is one of the critiques against the TRC, that it so perfectly performed the cutting, the separation of the past from the present, so much so that people couldn't realize the ways in which the past was still present, because there was this new South Africa that had been brought about.
Thank you, Keo. I mean, I have a question, I guess personal question, just before before more people ask questions. Mine has to do with Ubuntu, right? Because what I'm getting the sense of, I appreciate your centering of Ubuntu, by the way. I think that's very interesting kind of lens to look at it. And I have this kind of worry that Ubuntu was disproportionately demanded from the victim as opposed to the perpetrator. And in a way, it's also more than that. Ubuntu was almost a way to subdue the perpetrator, because I think in a way, what can I say, appealing to obviously some ethic that is that is part of the worldview of the oppressed, but perhaps is somewhat foreign to the oppressor, right? Kind of create some sort of imbalance, a power imbalance in who owes who Ubuntu, right? So I'm wondering, like, if that's a very similar observation that you have, and if you have any thoughts on this kind of, this observation, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact that Ubuntu is in that phrase, understanding, instead of, basically this context, this is in the interim constitution, calls for understanding in terms of vengeance, and I forgot the other one, but also Ubuntu, or reparation instead of retaliation, and then Ubuntu instead of victimization. The fact that Ubuntu, the word, is in there means that that phrase, that clause, is for a certain group of people, and those are Ubuntu communities or Ubuntu practicing communities. And so definitely it was a censuring of emotion. It was a way to caution against being diswart gevaar, which without saying don't be diswart gevaar. Like there was this idea that really, if something wasn't done to censure these raw emotions of vengeance and anger and resentment, there would be a civil war. I think I tried to be humble about the fact that I was 5 years old, in the early 1990s period. Maybe I don't realize just how close the country was to civil war. And maybe that's why I am so harsh on the TRC. But at the same time, the living conditions in which we find ourselves, the rate of violence, can be argued to be civil war proportions, And so I think really with that clause, there was a censuring, there was a cautioning against this expectation of rampant violence specifically against white people. It wasn't necessarily against other Black people. The caution, I don't think, was against so-called Black on Black violence. I think the caution was, we all know who's guilty here. We won't say them by name, but you shouldn't do to them what they did to you, you know? So, and the mere fact that even in the interim constitution, in the TRC Act, in the new constitution, there's no mention of Black or white, or even apartheid, even the word apartheid in the post-ambles or in the preambles, shows that there was really some underhandedness going on there epistemologically, some disingenuity, some major effort to create a we, to create a nation, to create a common identity. And in order to do that, some people's expressions of mourning and anger and pain had to be packaged and managed, not necessarily muted, because proponents of the TRC would say, but that's what truth-telling was for. But the truth was there to be told in order to be managed and packaged. Even if you think about a report, for instance. You know.
Yeah, thank you for your powerful thoughts. I think there's a lot to ruminate on. Hopefully even further conversation after this presentation today. I'd just like to invite Neo to ask a question, and that'll be our last question for the day until we close. Go ahead, Neo.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for this. I think this is one of my former lecturers, actually, from another university. Yeah, no, I'll just say I caught the talk in the middle, but it's very interesting. Thanks so much for this. It's just not necessarily a question, but just a couple of thoughts around this. You know, with the idea of retribution or punishment, so to speak, is I think what happened with the TRC, and even now Ubuntu still being miscarried, and I think I like that idea of a miscarriage, if you think of, you know, the birth of a new nation, so to speak, and how even that was almost a failure right from the start. If we look at, you know, maybe failure is a more harsh word, but this is sort of what this miscarriage of Ubuntu led to. And you look at some of the language that we use around nation states and that kind of thing, which in my view is just paradoxical. You know, if you're going to talk about a nation state where you have so many nations, and you're trying to build this new identity that sort of tries to accommodate people who don't necessarily belong and don't necessarily want to belong. If you look at how the basic premise of, you know, let's make peace, but you can't take anything away from us. You know, that is not how, if you look at the whole background of Batu who have Botu, that is not how they would do things. If you've offended someone, you have to come and apologize sacrificially to this person. And you don't get to dictate, you know, what it is that you sacrifice or the weight of the sacrifice. And I think if you look at the entire context of bringing in the church, bringing in Ubuntu, it's sort of it's a very superficial view of these deep philosophies that you look only at the good side of them. I mean, we'll talk about modernity, for example. We'll bring out the good side of how it brings about this change and progress and all of these things, but we'll then hide those really terrible effects of it, like your global warming and your climate change and all of these other things. And I think that is partly what has happened with the TRC and Ubuntu, is where you sort of want the cream on top of the cake, but not really the work that goes into making a proper cake. you know, because it wasn't always, I mean, Kasetu, you have some really harsh words like Ngesizulu, they'll call you Intswela boya, which means the only thing you need to be a complete animal is just fur, right? And that is the opposite of umuntu. And so you must be treated as a complete animal, you know, sometimes even worse than just an animal. So I think what you're bringing us some really helpful thoughts around this for those of us who are interested in research that looks at ubuntu. I mean, we still see these ideas being bastardized with things like your Bachopeli principles and those sorts of things, you know, putting people first. But the language that you find in those principles is you're still calling people, they deserve services because they are paying clients, not because they are people in the first place. So the TRC sort of looked at the effect of what Ubuntu could probably bring about without really looking at who it is serving and what it really means, according to this philosophy, what it means to be Umuntu in the first place. And I think those are just some of the notes that I'm taking for myself as well to go and read further on and just think further about. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Nell.
Thank you, Nell. Yeah, I think one of the readings that can help shape people's understandings of the problem of the continuation of South Africa, I think, is Towards a Post-Conquest South Africa by Mokgobe Ramose. There's another one called, I think it's called The End of South Africa, Philosophy of History, The End of South Africa by Ndumiso Tladla. And these readings really show how South Africa itself is based on a certain episteme that is not for indigenous or other conquered populations in South Africa. The fact that South Africa began in 1910 as an act of South Africa, and then in 1994, or in the negotiations process, there was a real drive to maintain legislative and legal continuity. There was no option where there were any secessions, a reimagining of South Africa beyond just assimilating Black people into the citizenry. So all of those things really show how Ubuntu could only be co-opted into this liberal agenda. At the end of the day, the Constitution espouses liberal values about the individual, about the rights of the individual, rights like to private property, even though you had communities that were injured as communities and not as individuals. Well, not fundamentally or only as individuals. And that's why you still have that critique of the TRC individualizing guilt, individualizing blame, individualizing victimhood. And so, yeah, I think it's really good to think about exactly what kind of episteme we're thinking from when, in the things we take for granted about what South Africa is and who South Africans are. And also thinking about why do we take those things for granted? Like, things are not common sense. Whose sense is common here, you know?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Keo. I think we've come to the end of the seminar. I think you've invited very critical thoughts, not just on the beginning of South Africa, but perhaps for where we're going. And also maybe an opportunity to really question the utility of our, commonly held moral beliefs, I guess, including Ubuntu in the broader scheme of things. So we'd like to thank you once again for joining us and for your presentation. And for everyone else who's interested, HUMA has multiple seminars running all the time. And you can find more information on that on the HUMA website. But for now, thank you for joining us. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you very much, Olerato and Sane as well for your invitation. And for everyone, thank you so much for your thoughts and contributions. They help me understand better what I'm thinking about, you know, so thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, bye everyone. Have a lovely day. Have a lovely rest of your day.